The protagonist, Lydia, inherited her mother's ability to see fairies invisible to ordinary people. Fairy tales and witches once filled England, but as times changed, fairies were forgotten, and their knowledge could no longer be passed on to humans. In this declining age, only those known as fairy doctors can still communicate with them. Lydia, able to communicate with fairies, moved to the countryside to train, accompanied by a talking fairy cat. Locals believed fairies were merely tricks. One day, Lydia received a letter from her father asking her to return to London. She boarded a ship with her cat. Recognized at the port due to her auburn hair, she was approached by a crew member who informed her that her father had upgraded her room. This seemed odd to Lydia, as her father was never wealthy. Upon entering the room, something felt off. She immediately checked the wardrobe, which was empty, but someone attacked her from behind. The fairy cat, Nico, bristled. Lydia thought she was doomed, but the man explained that the crew member was a villain who had kidnapped him and pleaded for Lydia's help. Lydia turned and noticed the man had marks on his hands from being bound. He warned her that she was also a target and that there was surveillance at the door. Lydia checked and indeed found a thread at the door. Believing him somewhat, she decided to cooperate with the man to escape. She approached a crew member and seeing many people behind him, she trusted the man more. She told the crew member about a suspicious man in her room. When the crew member went to check, Lydia and the man escaped. However, the crew soon caught up, and during the struggle, Lydia's bag accidentally fell into the sea. The two fled and boarded another ship. Nico, the cat, suspected the man was not simple and feared Lydia might be deceived. The man then removed a wig, revealing blonde short hair, and a handsome black-clad butler emerged, calling the man Master and expressing displeasure over his injury. The man introduced himself as Edgar, an Earl, and even knew Lydia's name. He revealed that the group was after Lydia. Realizing something was amiss, Lydia declared her intention to go to London. Edgar informed her that the ship had already set sail and that his capture by the crew was deliberate to get close to Lydia. He instructed his butler, Raven, to prepare a dress for Lydia. Before Lydia could react, Edgar took her to a dinner party. At the table, a noble mentioned Edgar's ancestors, claiming he was a descendant of the Blue Knight, a figure from myth who became a lord in the fairy kingdom. They praised Edgar as a true noble. Suddenly, Lydia spoke up, stating that the Blue Knight was indeed a lord of the fairy realm. She found it odd that the nobles believed in the Blue Knight, yet thought the fairy kingdom was mere fiction. The atmosphere grew awkward until Edgar intervened. He acknowledged his ancestral title and a land known as the fairy realm, only accessible with his wife, hinting at his affection for Lydia. Lydia was surprised. Later, on the deck, Lydia met Nico, who felt Edgar was being deceptive. If Edgar was truly a descendant of the fairy realm's lord, he likely needed Lydia's help as a fairy doctor. Nico advised Lydia to keep her distance, suspecting Edgar might be handsome but not trustworthy. Lydia believed Edgar couldn't be that bad. Edgar overheard her praising him. While others might mock Lydia for talking to her cat, Edgar expressed his belief in her and acknowledged the fairy doctor's role. He confirmed his descent from the Blue Knight, but admitted he lacked his family's abilities, needing the fairy doctor's help to find a mermaid's sword hidden by his ancestor on their land before his death. Edgar had intended to greet the Queen upon arriving in England, but could not prove his identity without the sword. Furthermore, mysterious individuals were after the gem on the sword, so Edgar needed Lydia's ability to understand fairy language to assist him. Lydia said she didn't believe Edgar was truly a descendant of the Blue Knight. However, she was now cornered against the railing with the sea behind her. Edgar's words carried implicit threats. Moreover, Edgar mentioned that someone named Haskell was also looking for her, implying she would be targeted regardless of her cooperation with Edgar. The approaching warship seemed to confirm Edgar's claims. Edgar took Lydia back to the room and showed her a coin engraved with fairy script. The writing was very small, so Lydia asked Edgar to fetch a magnifying glass, but he had already prepared a translation on a piece of paper in English. Lydia suggested the coin might be a fake, but Edgar argued that such fine text didn't seem like human work, mentioning techniques like nuclear boat memory and micro-carving. With no other choice, Lydia analyzed the translated rhyme and opened a map to locate the possible whereabouts of the sword. As a fairy doctor, she knew which areas were rich in fairy presence and related to mermaid legends. She pointed out a small island to Edgar, as they were unsure of the exact location of the sword and had to start searching slowly. Edgar also provided Lydia with a payment for her assistance. The warship had already approached and began searching for suspicious individuals on board. The group that previously captured Edgar had reported him, claiming that the killer depicted in the newspapers had kidnapped a young woman. The description of the killer, blonde hair with gray-purple eyes, matched Edgar's appearance exactly. However, Edgar looked too noble and did not resemble the killer reported to have murdered 100 people or engaged in robbery and murder. Most importantly, the killer had already been executed. However, the subordinates who followed still harbored suspicions. They heard rumors about the killer having a cross tattoo on his tongue, but they dared not offend Edgar. Nico overheard this conversation and immediately informed Lydia. The next day, Lydia was on a train and, seeing no one around, prepared to sneak a look at Edgar's tongue. Edgar stopped pretending to sleep and joked that he would continue pretending if Lydia kissed him. He flirted with her, but Lydia ignored him. Then, Raven entered with tea. Lydia asked Raven to pull Edgar away, but Edgar remarked that Raven might help him if he pretended to strangle Lydia. Lydia responded by slapping Edgar and then tried to throw boiling water at him, but Raven intervened. Although Lydia disliked Edgar, she had no ill will towards Raven and felt uneasy about possibly hurting him. Moreover, Raven was about her age and shared the same green eyes, a feature for which Lydia had been mocked, making her feel closer to Raven. However, Raven showed great trust in Edgar, revealing that he harbored a fairy spirit and Edgar was the only one who accepted him. After disembarking, Lydia was kidnapped by people from the Haskell family who had been pursuing them. Edgar, while investigating the sword, had encountered Haskell's father, who revealed Lydia's name, but was then shot by his son arriving on the scene. Haskell blamed Edgar for his father's injury and had been trying to kill Edgar while also intending to take Lydia away. Raven handled the individuals who kidnapped Lydia, allowing Edgar to pull her to safety. However, Haskell quickly caught up to them. Edgar was injured while defending Lydia, but managed to fend off Haskell. A man hiding in the corner witnessed Edgar choosing to protect others and concluded that Edgar was unsuitable as a successor. Nico, who had been invisibly following Lydia, urged her to escape while Edgar was injured. Lydia felt guilty about leaving, believing Edgar was injured because he protected her. However, Nico speculated that if Lydia were harmed, Edgar would lose any chance of finding the sword, suggesting Edgar's injury might be a ploy to gain her sympathy. Nico then gave Lydia a sleeping pill, noting Raven's absence as an opportune moment to escape. Lydia hesitated for a moment, then entered with water. Edgar, seeing that Lydia hadn't run away, began to share his past. He revealed that Edgar was a pseudonym. His real name had been erased since he was 12, after his father was suspected of betraying the queen and killed his family before committing suicide, severing all family ties. Edgar survived, but his life turned into hell. He was sold into slavery, where his tongue was branded with a cross. Later, Edgar killed his slave master, but was arrested by the police. Just when he was about to be hanged, a researcher bought him, wanting to experiment on Edgar's brain. Listening to this, Lydia was terrified and guessed that Edgar's quest for the sword was driven by revenge. However, Edgar was not the true heir to the Earl of Blue, so even acquiring the sword would be futile. Edgar admitted he had no choice. This was his biggest gamble. The original family name, now tainted by slavery, was useless to reclaim. He preferred to usurp the reputation of an Earl's descendant, seeing no harm in creating a false identity. Edgar shared a lot about his past, deeply moving Lydia, who then drugged his drink. Edgar noticed and advised Lydia not to provoke him, a criminal with a troubled past, for whom obtaining the sword was the only hope. He questioned if Lydia truly intended to abandon him, adding that if she left, all his hope would vanish, leaving him no reason to live. A clear case of emotional manipulation. Lydia, unfortunately, fell for this tactic. So when Edgar awoke again and saw Lydia still there, he resumed his slick, flattering ways. If not for his charming demeanor, Lydia might have already hit him. Raven returned with injuries, and the three reunited on the island known for mermaid sightings. Nico spotted 3 small fairies in a corner, all seeking Lydia's help to free the island's mermaid owner. When Nico asked about the mermaid's sword, the fairy suggested visiting a relative who might know. Meanwhile, Lydia, feeling seasick, collapsed. Edgar met someone claiming to be the island's only castle steward. The steward, upon learning Edgar was searching for the castle, mentioned that many claiming to be descendants of the Earl of Blue had come to the island, but they usually washed up on shore within 3 days. He also revealed that most islanders had mermaid blood, pointing out his own fish fins. While talking, Lydia noticed a small figure darting across the sofa. She asked Edgar for a glass of lemonade to use it to guide the fairy. Although Edgar couldn't see the fairies, he cooperated with Lydia's actions, which made her somewhat embarrassed. She knew Edgar was a smooth talker and a deceiver, but his charm was undeniable, especially as he was the first to believe she could see fairies. Despite her wariness, Lydia couldn't help but feel attracted to him, particularly when Edgar complimented her hair as caramel-colored and sweet-smelling, a tactic charmingly effective regardless of gender, but not to be emulated carelessly. Yet he met someone as innocent as Lydia. They both knew they were deceiving each other, but Lydia accepted his lies. Raven had a sister who had sacrificed herself to save Edgar. The three of them had always been trying to evade an organization that was after them. Edgar had great respect for Raven's sister, and even asked Raven to send Lydia, who had been eavesdropping outside, back to her room. Lydia, caught listening, turned and ran, but Raven caught up to her. Lydia was afraid Raven might kill her, but Raven explained that he and the fairy residing within him were slaves to Edgar. If Edgar was in danger, the fairy inside Raven would uncontrollably become violent, even killing beyond Raven's control. Therefore, Raven saw Edgar as the only restraint that kept him from becoming a murderer. Lydia asked Raven if he could find another master. Raven questioned if Lydia could accept him, tell him right from wrong, care for him, and never command him to kill others. Lydia remained silent and returned to her room. The next day, the trio followed the clues in the rhyme to explore the island. Lydia told Edgar that the steward had said those pretending to be the Earl would be dragged into the sea by mermaids. Edgar asked Lydia if she would be sad if he were gone. Lydia scoffed, suggesting he should go to Raven's sister, Ermin, who supposedly pampered him. Edgar clarified that he and Ermin were not lovers and had never spoken of Ermin to Lydia before. He knew Lydia had been eavesdropping and only said that Ermin and Raven were his companions. He would do anything to ensure their happiness. Although Edgar had been searching for the mermaid's sword and enlisted the help of Lydia, a fairy doctor, he didn't actually believe in the existence of non-human entities. He simply had high emotional intelligence and was willing to appear as if he believed. Therefore, he didn't truly think Raven had a fairy inside him. He just saw Raven as someone who needed help. The two followed the rhyme and found a door painted on a wall. However, Haskell arrived again with his men, accusing Edgar of abducting Lydia and urging her to leave with him. Edgar quickly called for Raven, then turned and fled into the forest with Lydia, only to be surprised when Haskell brought Lydia's father to the scene. Seeing his daughter running off with a stranger, her father immediately assumed Edgar was the kidnapper. Edgar promptly declared his love at first sight for Lydia, stating he would marry no one but her and hoped for her father's approval, which left Lydia's father momentarily speechless. Despite this, Edgar's noble demeanor made Lydia's father hesitate. Just then, Haskell rushed in again. Fearing his daughter might get hurt, Lydia's father tackled Haskell. Edgar joined the fight to protect his future father-in-law. Meanwhile, Nico took Lydia deeper into the forest, where they unexpectedly encountered a hellhound. Nico immediately ran away upon seeing the hellhound. Fortunately, Raven heard the noise and came to help. The fairy inside him took control, fighting the hellhound in a thrilling battle. Mid-fight, the hellhound fled. It was then that Raven realized Lydia was missing. By this time, Lydia had been captured and locked up with her father. Edgar seemed to have disappeared, and her father was still pondering the nature of Lydia and Edgar's relationship, seeing Edgar as nothing more than a flippant trickster. Just then, Raven popped in, insisting Edgar was serious and relayed a message for Lydia to pretend to comply with Haskell. Lydia knew Edgar was only close to her to get the mermaid's sword, but Raven mentioned that Edgar had not only a coin but also a silver key, and obtaining the sword required a blood sacrifice. Haskell then arrived, using her father to threaten Lydia into leading them. She complied, leading them to the basement where Edgar ambushed Haskell's group, knocking Lydia's father unconscious. Edgar promised that once they found the sword, he would release her father and ensure Haskell's group wouldn't harm him when they woke up. Lydia then led them into the maze, following the clues in the rhyme. They found an underground passage and used the small gold coin to open a secret chamber by the coast, which stored numerous barrels of alcohol, much to the delight of the fairies. At that moment, Nico rubbed Lydia's leg and told her the mermaid's sword was waiting for a new master. He urged Lydia to kill Edgar once she got the sword. But then Edgar heard a woman crying. Lydia said following the sound would lead them to the right place. They arrived at a bridge, and just after crossing, Edgar stopped Lydia and pulled out a silver key. Lydia recognized it, and Raven admitted he had revealed the secret because he had promised his sister to protect Edgar as much as possible, and he hoped Lydia wouldn't hate Edgar for it. Unexpectedly, Haskell caught up again and took Lydia's father hostage, demanding the mermaid's sword. However, Edgar had Raven cut the bridge and then dashed deeper into the secret chamber. Lydia feared Edgar wouldn't save her father because Raven had mentioned that obtaining the mermaid's sword required a blood sacrifice. She worried Edgar might use her as the sacrifice once he reached the sword in the water. Fortunately, although Edgar saw the mermaid's manifestation, he couldn't see the fairies and only grasped at the sword's apparition. Eventually, the sword ended up in Lydia's hands. She believed Edgar never spoke the truth. Nico urged Lydia to show no mercy and act immediately. However, Edgar stopped Raven from attacking Lydia, noting that Lydia was still too kind because she hadn't struck first. Edgar admitted his lies couldn't deceive Lydia, so he cut his own hand with the sword, offering himself as the sacrifice. Lydia was stunned, but the mermaid told her that the Earl had left no descendants, and only the fairy doctor could find this place. She hoped Lydia would free them, which required entrusting the sword to someone who could fulfill the Earl's wish. Lydia noticed the sword had no stars, and the mermaid explained the stars were engraved in the Earl's body, and only those inheriting the mark could retrieve the stars on the sword. Meanwhile, Haskell had stormed in with Lydia's father, but Nico and the fairies intervened, allowing her father to break free. Lydia decided to make a deal with the mermaid to bring Edgar back. Lydia, following Nico, reached the seabed where Edgar's spirit lingered, thinking he was dreaming. Lydia guessed that Edgar had offered himself as a sacrifice upon realizing the sword lacked stars, making it useless for proving his identity. Despairing, he chose suicide. Unable to bear Edgar dying like this, Lydia negotiated with the mermaid. She surmised that the mermaid and the Earl's deal aimed to protect the Earl, but since he left no heirs, the mermaid guarded the sword and stars in the cave, becoming desperate to pass on the sword. Yet, the contract required a soul if the stars weren't present. To avoid killing Edgar or Lydia, Edgar stepped forward, claiming a star mark on his tongue, which the mermaid acknowledged. She restored the star to the sword, recognized Edgar as the new Earl's successor, and sent them back. Edgar, having obtained the sword, received the Queen's approval and reclaimed his position as Earl. He publicly hired Lydia, a fairy doctor, with the Queen's permission, intertwining their fates once again. After Edgar became the Earl, a little fairy carrying the Fairy Queen's ring rushed to London, but was tricked by a man who could see fairies and lost the ring. By this time, Lydia had been the royal family's exclusive fairy doctor for 3 months. Rumors circulated that the Blue Knight, taken by the Fairy Queen, had a wedding. However, the knight didn't actually marry, but found a spell to break a curse. At that moment, Edgar approached with a list of guests for a ball, insisting Lydia attend and dance with him to prevent his jealousy. Lydia, however, saw Edgar as merely a smooth talker who even recited a spell to ward off fairies, saying, "If you want to be with me, bring the perfect moon," a task known to be impossible, prompting the fairies to back off. Realizing Lydia knew this spell and had already rejected the advances of fairies, Edgar playfully inquired if she had someone she liked. Lydia, often ostracized for seeing fairies since childhood, remembered a childhood friend when Edgar spoke. Edgar was relieved that Lydia's male companions were not very clever, giving him a chance. He learned that an artist had painted a portrait resembling the Fairy Queen, which looked very much like Lydia, and he collected these portraits. Because Lydia was to attend the ball, Edgar hired her a dance instructor. During her lesson, Nico arrived with a little fairy, a marigold fairy, who announced he had brought the Queen's ring and was about to bring back a groom for the Fairy Queen. Lydia was taken aback when suddenly the dance instructor attacked her. Fortunately, Raven threw a dagger in retaliation, causing the instructor to flee, leaving behind a moon pendant and calling Raven a prince's lackey. Putting aside the incident with the dance instructor, Edgar met the Marigold Fairy in human form, who reportedly brought the moon ring for the Fairy Queen's marriage pact with the Blue Knight Earl. Edgar was expected to be pleased, but the ring had been stolen en route by a fairy. Nico sniffed a stone from the Marigold's hand, expressing a bad feeling to Lydia. They decided to keep the Marigold with them, as without the moon ring, Edgar wouldn't be taken to the fairy world. Soon, the ball began. Edgar gave Lydia a corsage to wear on her chest, which she initially thought was a brooch. However, a gentleman at the party told her it symbolized their agreement to dance together, as they both wore matching flowers. Lydia believed Edgar knew she wasn't good at dancing, and used the flower to help cover this up. The gentleman, named Paul, was polite and well-mannered, and was the artist who had painted the Fairy Queen portraits that Edgar had bought. Paul mentioned that fairies were his muse, inspiring him with their invisibility and limitless imagination. Meanwhile, Edgar was busy socializing and dancing with many ladies on stage. Just as Paul was about to ask Lydia to dance, Nico noticed a fairy emerging from the fountain and running towards Lydia. Wow. Although Lydia was mentally prepared, she didn't expect him to arrive so quickly. Indeed, the fairy who stole the moon ring was Kelpie, the water fairy Lydia had once rejected. Kelpie was determined to marry Lydia and planned to take her back to Scotland, intending to forcibly place the moon ring on her finger. Paul noticed something was wrong and stepped in to stop him. In the struggle, the moon ring accidentally got stuck on Paul's finger and wouldn't come off. If Edgar hadn't arrived just in time, Kelpie might have cut off Paul's finger. Rivals turned particularly jealous upon meeting, but Edgar, protected by Raven, was a match Kelpie couldn't beat, forcing him to retreat. Afterward, Edgar invited Lydia to dance and asked if Kelpie was the one who had proposed to her. Lydia explained that Kelpie was just curious about the fairy doctor, which was why he proposed. Still, Edgar felt jealous. Lydia retorted, "You haven't dated me either." Edgar was taken aback and began to vehemently criticize Kelpie, claiming he was inferior in both modeling and wealth. Edgar knew Lydia didn't care about those things, and might even prefer someone like Paul, who seemed a bit clueless but passionate about life and his own goals. Edgar, feeling insecure, wondered if he was also becoming jealous of Paul. Lydia, seeing Edgar as a flirtatious character, told him not to take his words too seriously. Edgar hoped Lydia would take his words to heart, but Lydia was reminded of something from her childhood, turned around, and ran away in tears. The butler asked Edgar what was wrong. Edgar sighed, saying he was disliked by his future lady. The butler smiled, noting they weren't even in a relationship yet. It was just dislike. He then handed Edgar a letter claiming to be from the Scarlet Moon organization, associated with the Blue Knight, which was set to reclaim the sword and the life of the imposter. The next day, Edgar came asking Lydia about Kelpie. However, Lydia discovered that a pea blossom fairy had arrived, intending to take the queen's groom back. Upon learning that the ring was worn by another man, the fairy was shocked, but she decided to make do with the mistake and take Paul back as the Earl, planning to return for Edgar next time. After all, humans have short lives, so what if the queen marries several husbands? By then, the Earl might not necessarily be Edgar. Lydia couldn't just watch Paul being taken away. At that moment, Kelpie rushed out, stating that the moon ring was meant for Lydia, and disagreed with the fairies taking the ring. Edgar mentioned that Paul still had to paint a portrait for the manor with Lydia as the model. While painting, Paul remarked that Lydia understood Edgar well, mentioning that he had visited a noble's estate long ago and met a boy resembling Edgar today, with blonde hair and gray-purple eyes. The boy encouraged Paul to become a painter and promised to commission a painting from him in the future. However, soon after, the boy and his family perished in a fire. Lydia immediately realized that the boy was probably Edgar from the past, which explained why he invited Paul to paint, clearly remembering their past agreement. Edgar always stayed at home in the past due to asthma. Now, in the social circles, only one person remembers him from those days. At this point, Kelpie reappeared, insisting on taking Lydia away. Hearing that Raven was not around, he was prepared to harm Edgar. Lydia pulled out a Bible to stop Kelpie. Edgar proudly claimed that Lydia was fending off others for him. However, he then told Kelpie that Lydia had a stronger fondness for Paul and would step back if she chose Paul, not wanting to be disliked by her. Lydia was speechless, knowing not to trust Edgar's words, thinking he was just teasing her again. She felt that if he truly fell for her later, any confession would be taken as a joke. Edgar then managed to drive Kelpie away with some foie gras. Raven had been sent to investigate the Scarlet Moon organization and the situation with Paul's father. Lydia appeared holding an iris card from Paul. Edgar mentioned that irises symbolize expressions of love, and if Paul pursued Lydia, she likely wouldn't cry. Edgar confessed to Lydia again, claiming she was the only one who could understand him. Yet Lydia knew Edgar was only focused on revenge, and she could at best provide him some consolation, which wasn't real love but merely emotional comfort. Being just friends would be better. However, Edgar wanted Lydia to recognize his pursuit and bowed to kiss the back of her hand. At that moment, Paul arrived and took Lydia back home. Lydia was unsettled by Edgar's words. Seeing her upset, Kelpie brought her a fluffy chick. He had stopped attacking humans for Lydia's sake and hoped she would marry him. Lydia refused. She was fond of Edgar, but knew his affection was only superficial at the moment. Thus, she was unwilling to accept his exaggerated confessions and preferred to remain friends. Meanwhile, Edgar began investigating the moon ring. In myths, the Green Knight had two consorts, one representing the pale moon and the other the scarlet moon. However, rumors said these consorts were just tales, and one was actually the knight's daughter. Lydia's father shared this information with Edgar. Edgar felt that Lydia could easily see through him, but her father advised that courage was most important in love. He had left his closest fairy for his wife, suggesting that if Lydia fell for someone, she might also leave her father's side. On the other side, Paul was approached by members of the Scarlet Moon organization, who asked him to poison Edgar as revenge for his father. Paul was reluctant. Their conversation was seen by Earl. Wait, wasn't she dead? Edgar quickly found Lydia and apologized for his impulsive confession. He had always thought Paul was pursuing Lydia. Lydia sighed and said that Paul was actually most grateful to Edgar and mentioned the promise they had made years ago. Edgar, thoughtful, immediately went to find Paul. Paul had already removed the ring from his hand. Edgar revealed his father's surname, complicating Paul's emotions. Eventually, Paul dropped poison into his tea, but froze when Edgar mentioned he was better suited to be a painter than a poet. Paul realized Edgar was the boy from the past and immediately knocked over the poison. However, someone hiding behind the door attacked Edgar before Paul could intervene. Edgar was poisoned, and Lydia learned from Raven that Paul was an undercover agent for the Scarlet Moon organization, which believed that Little Red was the prince's subordinate, hence their attack on Edgar. To save Edgar, Lydia sought help from Kelpie. As a water fairy with purifying powers, he agreed to help in exchange for Lydia returning with him to the fairy kingdom. Lydia obtained a drop of his blood, which would evaporate upon contact with air, thus needing Lydia's lips to keep it safe. It could be used both internally and externally. Nico advised Lydia not to make a deal with Kelpie. He suggested that it would be better for Edgar to die and for them to return to Scotland sooner, especially since Lydia's father was still in the human world. Lydia said she would write to her father in the future. She kissed Edgar's wrist and realized he hadn't woken up, worried that the medication was too weak. Just as she was about to kiss him again, Edgar suddenly opened his eyes and said he had a nightmare about being unable to find Lydia in his old age because he was too overbearing and had completely lost her. Edgar hoped Lydia would stay by his side. Lydia said she would think about it, advised Edgar to rest, and then left. When Edgar woke up again and visited Lydia, her father informed him that Lydia had chosen the fairy world. They could do nothing and could no longer see Lydia. Edgar immediately realized that Lydia seemed to have chosen Kelpie and had left for the fairy world, forsaking her father for Kelpie. Raven, also feeling lost, asked if Nico had left as well. Edgar, invigorated, spoke with Nico. Nico explained that Lydia had contracted with Kelpie only as part of her duty as a fairy doctor. However, Edgar firmly believed that Lydia had gone with Kelpie to save him, convinced that she must really love him. Therefore, he asked Nico to take him to the fairy kingdom. Since Lydia had made a contract with Kelpie, he decided to first retrieve the moon ring and make a deal with the queen. So, Edgar and Raven broke into the Scarlet Moon organization overnight. Edgar had already guessed that its members were not truly subordinates of the Green Knight, but sought revenge against that prince's organization. With this in mind, Edgar, wielding a star-embedded sword, decided to recruit these people, especially when Paul stepped forward to speak for Edgar, stating that Edgar was not under the prince's command and had suffered persecution just like them. As a former member of the prince's organization, Edgar should have been hunted after escaping, but now he had become an enemy of the prince, claiming descent from the Green Knight. He convinced the Scarlet Moon members, retrieved the moon ring, and suggested they consider an alliance. Moreover, Edgar summoned 2 marigold fairies and headed to the fairy kingdom in front of everyone, gaining their recognition. In the fairy kingdom, Kelpie had just pounced on Lydia when he got beaten up. She had agreed to live in the fairy kingdom, but never agreed to marry. At that moment, Kelpie sensed an invasion of his territory and rushed out. Unexpectedly, Edgar had taken a detour and found Lydia first, proposing they escape. With Nico leading the way, the two successfully hid. Lydia then learned that Edgar had reached the fairy world using the marigold flower to avoid the queen's wedding. Edgar then took out the moon ring and proposed to Lydia, effectively exploiting a loophole. However, Lydia felt this was inappropriate, as the fairy world does not allow violating contracts, and Edgar had not expressed genuine love. Edgar had to compromise, claiming that human agreements could be renegotiated. He also tempted Lydia by mentioning her father was waiting for her, ultimately persuading her to accept his proposal. Their loophole was recognized, and with Kelpie not wanting to hurt Lydia, and the Pea Blossom Fairy suggesting they have a child soon to become the next Earl and marry the Fairy Queen, Lydia agreed. Kelpie expressed that he would wait for Lydia until she was ready to come to the Fairy Kingdom. Lydia returned to the human world, and Edgar immediately spoke of visiting his father-in-law, since Lydia had accepted his proposal and they should formally visit. Lydia remarked that it was just for show. Edgar smiled, claiming he didn't remember saying such a thing. Wow, shameless. Lydia turned and walked away. Paul woke up to find a woman in his bed, whose tears turned into pearls. Meanwhile, Kelpie also followed them to the real world, stating he would wait but not give up. Lydia hadn't worn the ring but kept it close and well preserved. Then, the fairy craftsman who made the moon ring came to her, noting its bright color and telling Lydia that the ring was originally the Green Knight's gift to his lady. The vibrant color indicated that the current Earl was very fond of her. Lydia said she was just keeping it temporarily, but the craftsman adjusted the ring's size and forcibly put it on her finger, stating only the Earl himself could remove it. Edgar was very happy, seeing Lydia wearing the ring as a sign of accepting him, especially knowing that only he could remove it. He was satisfied. Lydia thought the ring was just part of a marriage lie to facilitate their return to the human world, but Edgar argued that it was fine as long as Lydia accepted the marriage. The fairy craftsman brought a flower and told Edgar that Lydia had reasons for not agreeing to the marriage. He had witnessed the marriage of the first Earl and his lady and thought Edgar's treatment of Lydia was inadequate, questioning why he allowed the lady to dress so modestly. Unbeknownst to him, Edgar had already prepared, sending Nico to change into formal wear and taking Lydia to select a gown for her debut. During Lydia's dressing by the maids, her corset caused her to scream in pain. Raven burst in upon hearing this and saw something he shouldn't have, resulting in a jealous Edgar pulling him aside to dress in women's clothes and stay by Lydia's side to protect her. Lydia made her formal appearance as the fiancé, and other fairies were also invited. Kelpie, not learning from past mistakes, almost ate the food Edgar had prepared. It was Lydia who reminded him not to touch it. At that moment, Paul arrived with a woman whose tears turned into small pearls. Edgar immediately sensed something was amiss, but knew Paul was serious enough to take responsibility. However, the crying woman claimed Paul did not remember her. Edgar noticed her tears turned into amber and suspected she was a fairy, which is why he brought her to him, as Edgar now held the title of the Green Knight Earl, responsible for overseeing fairies. Yet, the woman said she could not feel any power from Edgar. Lydia hurried over and identified the fairy as a banshee, a guardian fairy tasked with protecting the souls of a noble family's deceased young. Paul said he met the banshee around a corner and her master appeared to be someone named Gladys, a descendant of a former Green Knight Earl, seemingly a female Earl. Before bed, Edgar asked Lydia for a hug. The next day, Paul revealed that all the paintings left by his father had been destroyed, suspecting the prince's organization was behind it. He agreed to stay at the castle temporarily and communicate with the banshee. Raven collected the amber from the banshee's tears. Lydia said that these were tears of sorrow and should not be used as ornaments. Additionally, the tears of the banshee's clan predict someone's death. If they could be lit, it meant they were ordinary amber, without fairy power. As the amber melted, Lydia said she would investigate the banshee's memories, but Edgar insisted on being involved in the investigation as the heir to the Earl. Since Lydia could see fairies, and he was her future partner, he felt he could not stand aside. Edgar removed the ring for Lydia, acknowledging that she was not yet ready to accept him, but he vowed to wait until she was willing. Just after Lydia took off the ring, she turned around and encountered Kelpie. Seeing she wasn't wearing the ring, Kelpie proposed to her again. Raven, who happened to pass by, witnessed this and almost got into a fight with Kelpie. After Kelpie left with harsh words, Raven warned Lydia against being fickle. Lydia retorted that Edgar seemed more like a playboy, not really needing her, to which Raven, at a loss for words, could only tell Edgar that Kelpie was constantly courting Lydia. Edgar, however, wanted Raven to befriend Lydia as a friend. Meanwhile, the banshee told Paul that she did not sense Gladys's presence in Edgar, noting that few people can see fairies today. However, she followed Paul because he smelled nice. Paul, trusting Edgar deeply, decided to paint a portrait of the banshee. Just after he left the room, Ermin found the banshee and said she would take her to meet the true descendant of the Green Knight Earl. Edgar discovered that although the amber was ignited, it did not vanish, indicating that the banshee's prophecy was true. Paul informed Nico that the banshee had disappeared. Offering a portrait as payment, he asked Nico to help him find the banshee. Together, the man and the cat found an abandoned mansion where the banshee was standing before a man who claimed to be the true descendant of the Green Knight Earl. The banshee confirmed that this man had Gladys's lineage. Surprisingly, Ermin, whom Edgar and others believed to be deceased, was also with this man. Nico tried to escape but was captured. Nico was soon thrown back to Edgar, and his whiskers had been plucked, leaving him quite distressed. He burrowed into a pillow and reported that the banshee was taken away by a strange woman, and that a man named Ulisses, claiming to be a descendant of the Green Knight Earl, and a fairy named Selchi were with them. Edgar was familiar with Ulisses, a close associate of the prince, and had encountered him before. The banshee's prophecy of an early death was expected to occur within a week. Edgar did not involve Lydia in the search. Lydia felt something was off. Paul, who was not taken, revealed Ulysses's goal: to find the amber sealing the banshee's memories. He also acknowledged that the prince's subordinate was indeed a descendant of the Earl. Communication alone would not gain the banshee's recognition, suggesting that Ulysses might indeed have the Earl's bloodline. If Ulysses were recognized, the protagonist's status could be threatened. Thus, they needed to find the amber sealing the banshee's memories first. The banshee approached Paul likely because the amber was on him, which instinctively attracted her due to its scent. This also explains why the prince's organization raided Paul's home, likely to cover up their search for the amber. Thus, Lydia decided to search for the amber at Paul's house. Meanwhile, Edgar lent the members of the Scarlet Moon organization to Paul for assistance. Elsewhere, Kelpie met Ermin, who urged him to quickly take Lydia away from the area to avoid potential danger to her life. Kelpie then approached Edgar, revealing he was doomed to die soon according to the banshee's prophecy. Kelpie even considered hypnotizing Edgar, but was interrupted by Raven knocking at the door. Raven sensed his sister's presence, but both knew that the dead cannot be resurrected, suggesting that Ermin might no longer be human. Lydia was comforting Nico, who mentioned that Ulysses was not just a fairy scholar, but could also control hellhounds. Remembering a previous attack, Nico urged Lydia not to get involved further in Edgar's affairs, and mentioned seeing Ermin, who was supposedly dead at sea, implying Edgar might already know this. Edgar suspected that a mole had infiltrated the Scarlet Moon organization, which is why Paul's father's paintings were targeted. He ordered the reduction of staff managing the paintings. Thinking of Raven's sister, who might have returned from the dead, he felt very conflicted. Drowning his sorrows in a tavern, He thought every woman in the paintings looked like Lydia and longed to see her immediately. At the time, Lydia was also very worried about Edgar's condition, so she went directly to the castle. There, she encountered a drunken Edgar. Little Flower was delighted to see Lydia and eagerly pulled her to drink together. Lydia's visit was primarily out of concern for Edgar, especially because of the situation with Ermine. Edgar was thrilled because Lydia seemed worried about him, interpreting it as a sign that she had feelings for him. He made an emotional advance that nearly led Lydia to his bed. However, just as he was about to succeed, he mumbled Ermine's name in a daze in front of Lydia. This act confirmed his reputation as a flirtatious character, professing deep love for Lydia while drunkenly calling another woman's name. Edgar dreamed that Lydia refused to accept him and chose to live in the fairy kingdom instead. Upon waking, he found a button from Lydia's clothing on his bed and panicked, asking Raven why he brought Lydia to him while he was drunk, as it was too dangerous for her. Raven remarked that Edgar spoke the same whether drunk or sober. Edgar quickly washed up, asked Raven to prepare a carriage and bouquet, and hurriedly went to propose to Lydia, thinking they had consummated their relationship the previous night. Lydia stated that nothing had happened, that Edgar had fallen asleep midway. Even so, Edgar planned to propose, but Lydia firmly rejected him, criticizing him for calling another woman's name while holding her, likening it to a man who looks at another dish while eating his own, calling him despicable. Edgar was stunned, not even recalling that he had called someone else's name. Lydia told Edgar that what he truly desired wasn't her, expressing her deep disappointment and unwillingness to trust Edgar anymore. Edgar had no choice but to return and ask Raven about the names he might have called. Raven teased him for being a womanizer with many names on his list. Dejectedly, Edgar went to investigate Paul's paintings. He recalled seeing a portrait of a blonde girl at the Duke's house, which Paul clarified was not painted by his father, but merely entrusted to him for safekeeping by the Duke. This might have been the reason why Paul's father was assassinated by the prince's organization. The group examined the text on the painting and discovered it told the story of a cursed prince who had made a pact with evil forces. As a result, Gladys, an Earl's descendant at the time, banished him. However, Gladys was near death and couldn't completely resolve the prince's issue, leaving the task to a future Earl. The prophecy stated that a future heir would finally kill the prince, and descendants of Gladys's line would obey the new Earl's commands. Edgar also had royal blood, which made him technically a prince to some extent. Therefore, some people believed he was not qualified to inherit the earldom and sought to dethrone him. At that moment, Ermine appeared before Edgar, saying she would take him to meet the prince. Edgar regretted not being able to be with Lydia, while Kelpie noticed Lydia's unhappiness and secretly entered her dreams, planning to take her to the fairy kingdom. Fortunately, the fairy from the moon ring intervened and urged Lydia to put the ring on. Kelpie then claimed that Edgar had only a few days left to live because the banshee's amber tears in Edgar's possession had not ignited. Lydia finally understood why Edgar had willingly removed his own ring. She put the ring on, determined to save Edgar. The next day, Lydia arrived at the castle where the butler informed her that as a fiancée, she could visit any time, regardless of whether Edgar was home or not. Paul rushed out to tell Lydia that they had found the painting with clues about the amber. The fairy from the ring emerged, admiring the painting's exquisite colors. Lydia remembered that the ring fairy could sense the location of gems. Indeed, the golden hair in the painting was made from amber pigment. Paul realized, having been poor before, he never considered amber could be used so luxuriously as pigment. Lydia decided to take the painting to find the banshee, with the ring fairy opening a fairy portal for her. Paul decided to accompany her to persuade the banshee. Meanwhile, Raven was searching everywhere for Edgar. Nico showed him a gap between the fairy and human realms. Unfortunately, Nico could only open the portal for Lydia. Just then, Ermine appeared, offering to take Raven with her. Upon learning Lydia was also missing, Nico had no choice but to follow them to find everyone. At that moment, Edgar had met Ulisses, whom he had seen before with the prince. However, Ulisses was a lavish, middle-aged man, and the youth claiming to be Ulisses now made Edgar suspect that, like himself, he might have been an experiment where memories of a noble were implanted. Edgar had been the youngest child in a duke's family, chosen to be the next vessel for the prince, which led his family to ruin due to the organization's persecution. The Green Knight Earl actually had no true descendants, and Ulysses, being a distant relative, had the bloodline, but was not a direct heir. Hence, he challenged Edgar to a fight. Lydia and Paul were transported to Ulysses's residence, where they immediately saw the amber tears upon landing. Following the trail, they found the room where the banshee was imprisoned. The banshee had thought Paul was killed by hellhounds, and was relieved to see him alive. Lydia asked the banshee if she could alter Edgar's fate, to which the banshee replied that it was determined by the tears, and she could not change it. At that moment, the hellhounds mentioned Ulysses was looking for the banshee. Lydia put on the banshee's coat and hood, impersonating her, and followed them. Unexpectedly, she encountered Edgar there. Both Ulysses and Edgar needed the banshee's recognition to legitimately become the heir to the earldom. Edgar took Lydia's hand and gently kissed the back of it, stating that Ulysses lacked the pride and protective nature of a noble. This comment angered Ulysses, who immediately rushed down to pull Lydia away. Edgar seized the opportunity, grabbed a gun, and pointed it at Ulysses's head. Edgar suggested that Ulysses might have a third body. Just then, a hellhound attacked, biting Edgar's arm. Lydia, sensing danger, quickly pulled Edgar away as they fled. Edgar fired the gun, hitting Ulysses in the shoulder, but not fatally. Ulysses did not pursue them, believing the hellhound's bite, with its toxin, would finish Edgar. The hellhound's clone chased after them, but Lydia threw herbs that could shield against fairies, successfully evading the threat. This also led Edgar to recognize that it was Lydia, not the banshee. Edgar felt it was too dangerous for Lydia to be there. If it were truly the banshee, she wouldn't have been harmed. But if Ulysses discovered Lydia was impersonating the banshee, he might kill her. Yet, Lydia thought that Edgar, by not telling her about the death prophecy and secretly coming here, was also not considering her safety. Edgar then realized that Kelpie had disclosed the invalidity of their marriage. Lydia, knowing the truth, had chosen to wear the ring and come to save him voluntarily, which made Edgar happy. However, he was worried that the death prophecy might involve Lydia, which is why he had not told her. Moreover, Ulysses's powers were different from Lydia's. Lydia acted as a mediator between fairies and humans, whereas Ulysses could make fairies obey him. Therefore, Edgar insisted that the banshee must not be entrusted to Ulysses. At that moment, the toxin in Edgar's body began to act. Lydia quickly supported him, while Paul was persuading the banshee to try to break the seal. The banshee said she couldn't do it, explaining that Edgar was reliable, but not her master. Just then, Ulysses and the hellhound arrived. Realizing the banshee was there, he deduced that the person who had escaped was Lydia, and noticed that the banshee was fond of Paul. Ulysses then commanded the hellhound to attack Paul. Lydia and Edgar were trapped in the snow due to Ulysses's powers, but fortunately, they were protected by the ring. However, a clone of the hellhound found them. Edgar, unable to move, shielded Lydia. At the critical moment, Kelpie appeared and saved them. Kelpie genuinely liked Lydia, and despite disliking his rival, still came to their rescue. The ring then escorted them back to the mansion. Nico was on his way there with Raven. Ermin, seeing Kelpie had dealt with the hellhound, commented that Kelpie was still too young and should try to pursue Lydia, or else his feelings might fade away. Meanwhile, Ulysses captured Paul and threatened the banshee. He exploded the painting that held the amber, initially thinking it was a useless prop. Ulysses carelessly threw it into a fire, but it didn't burn, and he realized the amber was inside. He then took the painting and the banshee, knocked Paul unconscious, and planned to bring the banshee before Edgar to break the seal. On the other side, Edgar, feeling the effects of the poison, played up his suffering, claiming he might die soon and wished to kiss Lydia before he died. Then, they encountered Ermin, who said she would help them leave the place. Although Lydia's father cannot see fairies, he knows they exist, and often prepares snacks at home because his wife and daughter can see them. Raven had already guessed that his sister was no longer human. Nico nodded, explaining that the souls of those who die at sea become new fairies, so it's likely that Ermin is under Ulysses's control. Nico suspected that Ermin had become part of the Selkie tribe, a group that cannot resist those who steal their fur. Lydia and Edgar also met with Ermin. Lydia mentioned that the poison in Edgar needed exposure to sunlight from the human world. Ermin then led them towards the exit. Edgar handed Lydia a gun, telling her to prioritize her safety in critical moments. Soon after, they found Paul unconscious and learned that both the banshee and the painting had been stolen. Edgar decided to retrieve them and asked Paul to protect Lydia before locking the door behind him. Edgar told Ermin that the Ermin he knew was already dead, leaving her looking desolate. She tried to explain, but Ulisses interrupted by stepping forward. When the banshee learned that Paul was still alive, she relaxed, only to be roughly pushed aside by Ulisses. Meanwhile, Raven and Nico passed by the door and casually freed Lydia and the others. At that moment, Ulisses had bitten his finger and used his blood to separate the amber from the painting. The banshee's memories returned, recalling her former master Gladys dying in battle against the prince, which overwhelmed her with grief and nearly caused her to faint. Ermin suddenly took the banshee hostage, threatening to kill her immediately if anyone acted rashly. This would prevent both parties from obtaining Gladys's power. Ulisses considered using Ermin's fur to threaten her, but Ermin had purposely avoided Edgar to act as an undercover agent and protect him at a critical moment. Therefore, she wasn't concerned about her own safety. However, Edgar did not want to sacrifice his kin and saw his imminent death at the hands of a controlled fairy. Raven arrived at the scene, appearing with a dramatic spin and jump. However, the controlled fairies couldn't be defeated. Lydia suddenly had an idea, but after Raven discovered Edgar was injured, the fairy inside Edgar went berserk and almost killed Ulisses. However, Ulisses had a hellhound by his side, leading to a fight between them. The hellhound's human-like appearance made Raven hesitate momentarily before being knocked back. Kelpie then rushed out and stopped the other fairies. The banshee, having regained her memories, did not recognize Ulisses as her master. Ulysses's plan backfired, infuriating him and prompting him to attempt to kill Edgar. The banshee, protecting Edgar, was bitten by the hellhound. Lydia seized the opportunity to shoot and break the twin moon illusion, allowing sunlight from the human world to enter and disperse the hellhounds. Ulisses was rescued by the hellhound, and before leaving, he harshly warned that the prince was soon to arrive in England. Ermin disappeared as the situation unfolded. After the sunlight entered, Edgar's injuries healed. Unfortunately, the banshee, being a fairy, could not heal from sunlight like humans do. The banshee chose Edgar because of a request from Gladys, and importantly, Edgar acknowledged her as one of the family fairies. Therefore, she chose to save Edgar, effectively taking on his death fate for him. Before leaving, she handed the key to her power to Edgar and recognized the ring in Lydia's hand, telling the three that she was about to return to her master. Ermin seemed to have developed some feelings for Kelpie. On another note, Edgar still couldn't remember whose name he had called, but he did remember to confess to Lydia, saying her presence made him abandon his desire for revenge. He was annoyed by the thought of Lydia being taken by someone else after his death. Now that he had the recognition of Gladys and the banshee, he wondered if he should continue risking his life for revenge or stay and protect his family. He then asked Lydia for a kiss, which landed on her forehead, finally achieving a kiss. This is what you call playing with fire when chasing after your wife. It can end in disaster.